Porcupine Tree est un groupe, mais c'est avant tout l'œuvre de son chanteur-guitariste Steven Wilson, un Anglais hyperactif qui collectionne les projets musicaux. Son nom est aussi associé à des groupes comme Marillion, mais aussi Opeth, dont il a produit 3 albums. Un monsieur qui gagne à être connu, c'est pourquoi nous sommes allés lui poser quelques questions.
I'm Steven Wilson, and from the band Porcupine Tree. I play guitar, I sing, I write songs. And Porcupine Tree is a band that's been around since the late 80s, early 90s, a long time now. More than 15 years anyway. And we are, I guess you would describe us as a band that make albums instead of singles, and we like to create a kind of musical journey in rock and sonic terms. So we're very much inspired by the generation of 70s music. Progressive rock, album rock, intellectual rock. For me, it's more a question of being inspired by the whole kind of era. There was an era really from the late 60s, starting with bands like the Beatles and the Beach Boys, Sgt. Pepper and Pet Sounds, through, probably for 10 years through to the arrival of punk in the late 70s. That kind of era for me is like a golden era of album-orientated music, when bands really tried to raise the level of pop music or rock music to the level of a real art form. And that whole era has kind of influenced and inspired Porcupine Tree, rather than individual. I mean, I could pick individual bands, but I think there's a general kind of feeling that that era was very inspirational to the band. Mother sings a lullaby to a child. In the late 80s, early 90s, when I was just beginning to be a professional musician after I left school, I worked with a lot of musicians on projects, sessions. I was doing music for TV and commercials. And during that time I met a lot of musicians, great musicians, and some of those musicians I knew would be very sympathetic to what I was trying to do in Porcupine Tree. So when the time came to put together a live band, a band to actually play the music live, which was the first concern, I already kind of had in my mind certain people I'd worked with, like particularly Richard, the keyboard player, because we'd both talked about the music we loved, and so I knew he was going to be into what I was trying to achieve with Porcupine Tree, and that applies to the drummer and bass player as well. Fear of a Blank Planet it's different in that it was very much planned as a continuous 50-minute cycle of music, and on previous albums there was always like 2 or 3 shorter songs, maybe could have got played on the radio. This time we've been very self-indulgent. It's a very intense piece of music, and it all centres around the same subject, which is my fear that the current generation of children or kids born into this world of information technology and the internet and PlayStation and iPods and cell phones and DVD and plasma TV and American Idol. My fear that this generation is going to be not a soulless generation, but a generation that finds it very difficult to be passionate and to be curious about the world, because they're bombarded so much with so much information all the time. It's almost like white noise. And I worry that it's all going like this, you know, everything from music every piece of music is free on the internet, culture, information, news, pornography, violent, it's all just there on the internet now. So there's a sense that kids, I think the human race is by definition, I think it's in our nature to appreciate the things that we have to work hardest to achieve the most, and things that come easily we don't really appreciate and we don't make a real connection to. Although they've got a lot more than I had when I was a kid, in a way I don't envy them, because it's almost like they've got too much. We were looking for some way to kind of encapsulate just in one simple image the whole idea. So I came up with the idea of the child's face reflected in the glow of a TV screen with a kind of blank eyes. And that's in some respects it's very literal, a very obvious interpretation of the title, but it says it all really. I don't have a sort of system whereby if one project is more successful then it becomes more important to me. That's not why I make music. The reason I make so many different kinds of music is because I feel as a person I need to explore all of these musical possibilities. It's like exploring different parts of my personality, so to not be able to do that would feel like, you know, very oppressive to me. So Porcupine Tree, it's the most successful thing I do, it's the most commercially successful thing I do, but I have to say that some of my other projects are just as close to my heart, if not closer in some ways. They're all very important to me. My work is important, I suppose. I kind of started to do production work a few years ago, and I really enjoy producing bands. And there are a few bands that I would like to really love to produce, in my dreams probably, but there's a band called Meshuggah from Sweden. You know them? They're one of my favourite bands. Love to work with them. And Tool, I'd love to work with Tool. Yeah. So those kind of bands. I grew up listening to one French band called Ange. I don't know if you know Ange. You know Ange? Yeah. And I worked with them a few years ago. I mixed some tracks for one of their albums. But actually, a lot of the French I do know, and I do a little bit of French. I learned from listening to Christian Descamps' lyrics.
Voilà, c'est fini. Rendez-vous dans quelques semaines pour un nouveau NoisePod avec un groupe plutôt bruyant. Si l'émission vous a plu, n'hésitez pas à nous laisser un commentaire sur notre site. Je vous souhaite de bonnes vacances. À bientôt.